Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a topic that most history books politely skim over, if they mention it all. Forget the knights in shining armor and the damsels in distress. We're going to peel back the layers of medieval society and see what S3X was really like. Imagine yourself transported back, not to a grand castle, but to a muddy, bustling village street, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely animal. You're navigating cobbled paths, trying not to step in the refuse, and realizing pretty quickly that your modern sensibilities are about as useful as a chocolate teapot here. Forget your fancy indoor plumbing, your breathable fabrics, and definitely forget your easy access to contraception. You probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone thrive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the crossroads of faith and flesh in the medieval world, a place where the church's pronouncements on morality were as omnipresent as the village bell. Yet human nature found a way. On one hand, you had the unyielding doctrines of the church, particularly the Catholic Church, which essentially dictated that sexual activity was primarily for procreation within the confines of marriage. Any deviation from this narrow path was considered a sin, a moral failing that could jeopardize your immortal soul. Think about that for a second. Every urge, every fleeting thought, every act outside the approved parameters was potentially stacking up against you for the afterlife. This wasn't just abstract theology. It seeped into the very fabric of daily life, influencing laws, social customs, and even the art you saw in the local church. You'd hear sermons railing against lust, see carvings depicting the torments of the damned, all reinforcing this idea that the body was a vessel for sin if not properly controlled. But then, you'd glance around, and the reality of life would hit you square in the face. People were still people. They fell in love, they felt desire, they made mistakes. The official word from the pulpit might have been clear, but the lived experience was a murky, complicated mess. Historians still argue whether the common folk genuinely internalized these strict moral codes, or if they simply paid lip service while quietly getting on with the business of living. It's a debate that highlights the fascinating tension between ideal and reality. You might, for instance, encounter a couple openly living together without formal marriage, or hear whispers of affairs within the local lord's household, all while the church continued to preach abstinence and chastity. It was a constant push and pull, a dance between piety and pragmatism. The village priest might preach against premarital relations, yet he might also be the one hearing confessions from half the parish who had, shall we say, slipped up. It was less about absolute adherence and more about damage control, or perhaps a resigned acceptance of human frailty. Take, for example, the concept of carnal knowledge itself. For the church, it was a necessary evil, tolerated only within marriage for the purpose of bringing new souls into the world. Any pleasure derived from it was secondary, almost regrettable. Yet, outside the monastic orders, most people weren't exactly rushing to take vows of chastity. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and their lives were often harsh, short, and brutally physical. For them, intimacy, even if officially frowned upon in certain contexts, was a natural part of existence, a source of comfort, connection, and yes, even pleasure. You'd see evidence of this everywhere, from the bawdy songs sung in taverns to the surprisingly explicit carvings found in some church. Here's a quirky tidbit that always makes you wonder about the medieval sense of humor, or perhaps their artistic interpretations of moral warnings gone awry. So, while the church laid down the law, society often found pragmatic workarounds. Penalties for sexual transgressions, while harsh in theory, could vary wildly in practice depending on your social standing, your wealth, and the temperament of the local lord or bishop. A peasant caught in an illicit affair might face public humiliation or a hefty fine. while a powerful noble could often escape with a mere slap on the wrist or perhaps a generous donation to the church. It was a world where strict rules coexisted with a very human tendency to bend, break, and occasionally ignore them altogether. You were constantly navigating this duality, trying to maintain your reputation while still living your life. It was a balancing act, and one that required a good deal of cunning and discretion. And if you think navigating modern social media is tricky, try managing your reputation in a village where everyone knows everyone's business and gossip travels faster than a plague rat. So, you've grasped the official line versus the lived reality, a pretty common theme in history, wouldn't you agree? Now, let's talk about something often romanticized to an absurd degree: courtly love. If you've ever read a fairy tale or watched a period drama, you've probably encountered the idea of a knight, utterly devoted to a beautiful, unattainable lady, perhaps the wife of his liege lord. He writes poetry for her, performs brave deeds in her honor, and pines away with a noble, chaste adoration. You're picturing whispered vows under a moonlit balcony, right? Well, dim those romantic spotlights for a moment. The truth about courtly love, or fin amour as it was known in its troubadour origins, was far more complex and, frankly, less about bodice-ripping passion and more about social performance. It emerged in the aristocratic courts of southern France in the 11th and 12th centuries and quickly spread across Europe. This wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was a highly formalized game, a kind of social etiquette for the elite. The love was almost always unconsummated, platonic, and often directed toward a married woman. Why married? Because she was unattainable, elevating the devotion to a higher, purer plane, theoretically. Plus, it avoided messy inheritance issues, which, in a world driven by lineage and land, was a pretty big deal. You wouldn't want to accidentally legitimate a child that wasn't your lord's, after all. The knight's role was to suffer nobly for his lady, to be inspired by her to achieve greatness, whether in battle or in a poetry competition. He would compose songs, write verses, and wear her favor in a tournament. She, in turn, might grant him a small tokena ribbon, a glovey as a sign of her acknowledgement, but rarely anything more. This wasn't about running off into the sunset. It was about refining manners, showcasing chivalry, and demonstrating an almost spiritual devotion that elevated both parties, or so the theory went. It was a fascinating blend of idealized love and very practical social maneuvering. Historians still argue whether courtly love was ever truly practiced as idealized, or if it was predominantly a literary construct and a courtly game. Was it a genuine, albeit platonic, emotion, or a sophisticated social code designed to reinforce class distinctions and diffuse potentially disruptive desires? Think of it as a medieval version of celebrity obsession, but with far more rigid rules and a lot more poetry. The lover wasn't seeking physical intimacy, but rather moral and spiritual improvement through his devotion. He'd become a better knight, a more honorable man, all for the sake of his lady's approval. It was a bizarre kind of self-help system, fueled by unfulfilled longing. A quirky tidbit: some scholars suggest that these highly stylized performances of courtly love might have served as a pressure valve, allowing for intense emotional expression within the confines of a strict social order, without actually threatening the existing marital and property arrangements. It was like a very elaborate public fan fiction acted out by real people. You might see a knight publicly declare his undying, chaste devotion to a duchess, knowing full well that both their reputations depended on keeping it purely intellectual. This was a far cry from what we consider romantic love today. There was no expectation of mutual affection leading to marriage. In fact, if the lady reciprocated too openly, it might actually diminish the value of the knight's suffering and the purity of the pursuit. It was about the journey, not the destination. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern dating app user. Swipe right if you're interested in a lifetime of unrequited devotion and writing sonnets about my moral superiority. You probably wouldn't get many matches, would you? So, while the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere might paint a picture of tragic, passionate affairs, The reality of courtly love was usually much more restrained, much more cerebral, and deeply intertwined with the aristocratic social structure. It was a performance, a way to demonstrate refinement and status, rather than a blueprint for a passionate relationship. It was about chivalry, honor, and a highly stylized form of yearning, all carefully choreographed within the public eye. And if you somehow managed to get caught up in one of these relationships, you knew exactly what the unspoken rules were: admiration from afar, endless praise, and absolutely no hanky-panky. Having navigated the surprisingly non-sizzling world of courtly love, let's turn our gaze to the bedrock of medieval society: marriage. If you're imagining blushing brides, heartfelt vows of eternal devotion, and romantic proposals on bended knee, you're about 1,000 years too early. Medieval marriage was, overwhelmingly, a practical affair, a calculated arrangement, and very rarely about anything as fluffy as love. For the vast majority of people, marriage was an economic and social contract, a way to secure land, forge alliances, or simply ensure the continuation of a family line. You, as a young person in medieval times, would have had little to no say in who you married. Your parents, or even your lord, would make the decision for you, often based on what was best for the family's coffers or its standing in the community. Think of it less as a personal choice and more like a corporate merger, but with more livestock and fewer spreadsheets. The dowry, which was property or money brought by the bride to the marriage, was a crucial component, essentially the bride's contribution to the marital estate. It wasn't uncommon for negotiations over dowries to drag on for months, highlighting just how central financial considerations were to the entire process. For peasants, a marriage might mean two families pooling their meager resources to work a more productive strip of land. For nobles, it could be the difference between peace and war, uniting powerful houses and cementing political power. Love, if it ever developed, was a happy side effect, a bonus rather than a prerequisite. You might meet your spouse for the first time on your wedding day, a truly awkward blind date by modern standards. Imagine tying your entire future to someone you've literally just met, all based on a ledger sheet. No pressure, right? The concept of free consent, as we understand it today, was largely absent. While the church increasingly emphasized that both parties should consent to the union to make it valid, this consent was often given under immense familial or societal pressure. A young woman might be consenting because to refuse meant social ostracism, disinheritance, or worse. Historians still argue whether this church emphasis on consent genuinely empowered individuals or merely provided a theological fig leaf for what remained, in practice, arranged marriages. It's a nuanced debate about how much agency people truly possessed in a highly hierarchical society. Even after the wedding, the dynamics were often starkly different from modern expectations. A wife's legal identity was often subsumed into her husband's. She generally couldn't own property independently, enter into contracts, or represent herself in court without his permission. Her primary roles were to manage the household, bear children, preferably sons, of course, and support her husband's endeavors. While a wife held significant practical authority within the domestic sphere, especially for managing servants and daily logistics, her legal standing was often quite limited. It was in many ways a partnership of necessity, with clearly defined, often rigid, roles. A quirky tidbit that underscores the transactional nature of these unions. It wasn't uncommon for a man to quickly remarry after his wife died, sometimes within weeks or even days, particularly if there were young children needing care or if his household needed a manager. Emotions certainly existed, but grief was often secondary to the immediate practical need for a functioning household and the preservation of the family line. It wasn't coldness, it was survival. You had to keep the farm running, the children fed, and the social fabric intact. So, while we might view this as callous today, in medieval terms, it was simply pragmatic. So, when you think about medieval marriage, wipe away the cinematic montages of romance. Instead, picture a ledger, a handshake, and a quiet, often solemn ceremony where two people, likely strangers or mere acquaintances, committed to a life together out of duty, necessity, and the hope of progeny. It was a foundation, not a flourish. With the practicalities of marriage firmly in mind, let's navigate the treacherous waters of sex outside marriage. If medieval marriage was a ledger, then illicit affairs were a rapidly accumulating debt, with potentially ruinous interest. In a society so deeply intertwined with the church's moral authority and so dependent on clear lines of inheritance, any sexual activity outside the sanctioned marital bond was not just a sin, but a social and often legal transgression with severe consequences. You weren't just risking a stern lecture, you were risking your reputation, your livelihood, and even your physical safety. Adultery, particularly by a married woman, was considered a grievous offense. For a husband, his wife's infidelity threatened the legitimacy of his heirs, throwing the entire concept of lineage and property inheritance into chaos. Imagine the anxiety. Was the child truly his? This concern for bloodlines wasn't just about pride. It was about power, land, and the continuation of the family name. The penalties for a woman's adultery could be brutal, ranging from public humiliation like being paraded through the streets or having her hair shorn to severe physical punishments, even death in some extreme cases, though the latter was less common in later medieval periods in Western Europe. For the man involved, while often facing less severe penalties, he could still be fined, banished, or even physically assaulted by the aggrieved husband. It was a clear demonstration of the double standard at play, where female fidelity was paramount and male indiscretions were often overlooked or dealt with more leniently. Historians still argue whether these harsh legal codes were primarily designed to enforce moral purity or to protect male property rights and social order. Fornication, meaning consensual sexual relations between unmarried individuals, was also condemned by the church, though often viewed with slightly less severity than adultery. While not threatening legitimate heirs, it was still seen as a sin that corrupted the soul and violated divine law. You might face penance from your priest, a fine from the local lord, or social ostracism within your community. Imagine trying to keep such a secret in a close-knit medieval village where everyone knew everyone else's business, and gossip traveled faster than a particularly juicy scandal at the local market. There were no anonymous internet forums to vent your woes, only the watchful eyes of your neighbors and the ever-present fear of damnation. Then there was the shame. For an unmarried woman, becoming pregnant outside of marriage was catastrophic. She faced immense social stigma, potentially losing her standing in the community, being cast out by her family, and struggling to provide for herself and her child. Her child, if it survived, would also face the stigma of illegitimacy, often having fewer rights and limited opportunities. A quirky tidbit: some women resorted to desperate, often dangerous, measures to conceal pregnancies or induce miscarriages, using traditional remedies or even seeking out those with knowledge of more potent and perilous concoctions. This grim reality underscores the immense pressure and fear surrounding premarital pregnancy. While the church preached abstinence outside marriage, human nature, as we discussed, often found its own path. Taverns, festivals, and even rural isolation could create opportunities for dalliances. Sometimes these clandestine relationships were born of genuine affection, other times out of desperation or simply human desire. But the underlying threat of discovery and its consequences always loomed large. You couldn't just swipe right and disappear after a bad date. Your reputation followed you everywhere, and a single misstep could echo through your life for years. So, while movies might romanticize medieval life, the reality for those who strayed from the prescribed path was often one of fear, secrecy, and severe repercussions. It wasn't about getting away with it. It was about hoping you didn't get caught, and for many, that hope was a fragile thing indeed. Given the dire consequences of unsanctioned sexual activity, and particularly unwanted pregnancies, it's only natural that people sought ways to avoid conception. So, let's wade into the fascinating, if often disturbing, world of medieval contraception. desperate measures. Forget modern birth control pills or even reliable condoms. People in the Middle Ages were operating with a blend of folk remedies, superstition, and surprisingly rudimentary biological knowledge, often with little success and significant risk. You were essentially playing a game of chance with very high stakes. The primary method, of course, was abstinence, often practiced rhythmically, though without any real scientific understanding of ovulation cycles. People knew that certain times were safer than others, but this was based on observation and guesswork rather than precise biological calendars. The Church, while condemning contraception, did allow for marital intercourse only on certain days, specifically avoiding holy days, fast days, and periods like Advent and Lent. This meant that for devout couples, a significant portion of the year was off limits, perhaps inadvertently limiting conceptions. Historians still argue whether these religious restrictions had a noticeable impact on birth rates, or if people simply found ways around them. Was it genuine piety, or simply a convenient excuse? Beyond abstinence, you enter a realm of astonishing and often frankly bizarre concoctions and practices. Many of these remedies were passed down through oral tradition or found in illicitly copied medical texts, often blending genuine herbal knowledge with outright magical thinking. A common belief was that ingesting certain herbs could prevent conception or induce abortion. For instance, rue, savon, and pennyroyal were all used for their supposed abortifacient properties, though they were highly toxic and could easily poison a woman taking them. Imagine trusting your life and your uterus to a mixture of potentially lethal plants because you were desperate to avoid pregnancy. You were literally risking your life for a chance at control. Some methods veered into the truly strange. A quirky tidbit. One historical text suggests a woman should wrap the testicles of a weasel around her thigh to prevent pregnancy. Another mentions a concoction of pulverized bee mixed with water. Still others advised carrying various amulets, like a piece of mule's womb or wearing specific stones. While these sound utterly ridiculous to our modern ears, remember the context. A lack of scientific understanding, a deep belief in the power of sympathetic magic, and overwhelming desperation. People were literally trying anything, no matter how outlandish, if it offered even a glimmer of hope. You might try every single one of these, feeling a desperate mix of hope and absurdity with each attempt. Mechanical barriers were almost non-existent. While some speculate about early forms of rudimentary condoms made from animal intestines or bladders, these were likely very rare and primarily used to prevent disease, not conception, and certainly not widely available. Douching after intercourse was probably common, using acidic liquids like vinegar, though its effectiveness would have been minimal and potentially harmful. Withdrawal was likely practiced, as it required no special knowledge or materials, but its success rate is notoriously low. The constant threat of unwanted pregnancy shaped many aspects of medieval life, particularly for women. It was a primary factor in decisions about marriage, the management of sexual relationships, and the desperate attempts to control one's fertility. The lack of reliable methods meant that many women lived under a perpetual shadow of fear, knowing that a single moment of intimacy could lead to profound and life-altering consequences. So, when you consider medieval people, remember they weren't just dealing with plagues and famines. They were also navigating a world where their reproductive lives were largely beyond their control, relying on hope, prayer, and occasionally a weasel's testicle. Having plumbed the depths of medieval contraceptive methods, let's pivot to something equally fundamental to daily life, something that profoundly influenced medieval intimacy: hygiene. If you're imagining fragrant baths, fresh linens, and regular dental care, you're in for a rather grimy reality check. The Middle Ages, by and large, were not a period known for its pristine personal cleanliness. You were, quite simply, going to be a bit whiffy. And so is everyone else. First, let's dispel the myth of the utterly filthy medieval person who never bathed. This isn't entirely accurate, but neither is the idea of frequent, luxurious cleansing. Bathing did happen, especially for the wealthier classes who might have access to bathhouses or private tubs. However, these weren't daily rituals. For the vast majority of peasants, a full-body wash might be an infrequent event, perhaps a few times a year, often in a shared tub. Imagine sharing bathwater with several family members, one after the other. It wasn't exactly a spa day. You'd likely be relying on quick washes of hands and face, and a lot of wiping down with damp cloths. Water was often a precious commodity, especially clean, heated water, and gathering it was a laborious task. You wouldn't just turn on a tap, would you? Personal hygiene beyond bathing was equally rudimentary. Oral hygiene, for instance, involved rubbing teeth with rough cloths or herbs to freshen breath. But modern toothbrushes and toothpaste were centuries away. Imagine the breath. Dental problems were rampant, and abscesses or lost teeth were a common affliction, making intimate encounters potentially less than pleasant. Hair was another issue. While some used lye-based soaps or herbal rinses, head lice were a near-universal problem. You'd constantly be scratching, and anyone you got close to would likely be sharing the problem. It was just a fact of life, like bad weather or difficult harvests. Clothes weren't changed daily either. Outer garments might be worn for weeks or even months without washing, particularly for the poor, who often had very few changes of clothing. Undergarments, usually made of linen, were changed more frequently, as they were easier to wash. But even then, frequently might mean weekly, not daily. Imagine the accumulated smells, a blend of sweat, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and whatever else you'd picked up from the farm or the street. Historians still argue whether the general acceptance of these odors meant people simply didn't notice them after a while, or if they were a constant, underlying sensory experience. Was it truly normalized or just endured? A quirky tidbit: public bathhouses, which did exist in larger towns and cities, sometimes served as places for social gatherings, business dealings, and yes, even prostitution. They were not always seen as places of pure cleansing, often having a more ambiguous reputation. So, you might go to get clean, but also inadvertently wander into a more illicit scene. It was a multi-purpose establishment, much like the local tavern. And then there's the waste. Human and animal waste was often simply discarded into streets or rivers, creating incredibly unsanitary conditions. The concept of proper sewage systems was largely absent. Imagine the smells in summer, particularly in a densely packed town. Diseases spread rapidly, facilitated by poor sanitation, contaminated water, and a general lack of understanding about germ theory. Your intimate interactions would be taking place in an environment where disease was a constant companion, where even a small cut could lead to a fatal infection. So, while romantic paintings might depict pristine medieval scenes, the reality of everyday life involved a constant battle against grime, odors, and the very real threat of sickness, all of which undeniably impacted the physical closeness between people. Given the widespread grime and rudimentary hygiene, it's perhaps unsurprising that disease and death were not abstract concepts in the medieval world. They were constant, looming companions. This omnipresence of sickness and mortality profoundly shaped attitudes towards life, relationships, and even the very idea of intimacy. You lived with a palpable awareness that life was fragile, a brief, flickering candle in a vast, dark world. Imagine waking up each day knowing that a simple fever could quickly escalate into something fatal, that a minor cut could fester into a deadly infection, or that the cough you developed might be the precursor to a lung-consuming illness. There were no antibiotics, no advanced surgical procedures, and certainly no vaccines. Medical understanding was rudimentary, often blending empirical observation with superstition and religious belief. Physicians, if you could even afford one, often relied on practices like bloodletting, purgatives, and herbal remedies, many of which were ineffective and some actively harmful. You were essentially relying on luck, prayer, and your body's own resilience. The Black Death in the mid-14th century, which wiped out an estimated 1/3 to half of Europe's population, is the most dramatic example of this reality, but it was far from an isolated incident. Plagues, dysentery, smallpox, measles, and influenza regularly swept through communities, particularly affecting the young and the old. Child mortality rates were staggeringly high. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to bear many children, only for half or more of them to die before reaching adulthood. Imagine the emotional toll, the constant cycle of hope and profound grief. This constant dance with death undoubtedly influenced the desire for progeny, as each surviving child was a triumph against overwhelming odds, a fragile continuation of the family line. This constant proximity to death also fostered a different perspective on relationships. Love and intimacy, for many, might have been experienced with a greater intensity, a recognition of their fleeting nature. Why delay affection when tomorrow was never guaranteed? Yet, it also created a certain emotional resilience, a necessity to move on quickly when tragedy struck. You couldn't afford to be paralyzed by grief for too long. The farm still needed tending, the children still needed feeding, and life, however brutal, had to continue. Historians still argue whether this pervasive mortality led to a more fatalistic view of life or, conversely, a greater appreciation for its immediate pleasures and bonds. Was it a grim acceptance or a carpe diem mentality? A quirky tidbit: the skeletal remains found from medieval burials often show evidence of a multitude of chronic conditions, from nutritional deficiencies to severe dental problems and healed fractures, indicating a life of physical hardship. People lived with pain and discomfort as a daily reality, something we would find almost unbearable today. You'd have friends, family, and neighbors constantly suffering from various ailments, their bodies scarred by disease and injury. This physical vulnerability surely impacted the way people perceive their own bodies and the bodies of their loved ones. So, when you picture intimacy in the Middle Ages, remember it wasn't just about emotional connection or physical desire. It was also about survival, about legacy, and about finding moments of warmth and connection in a world where disease was rampant. Death was a familiar specter, and every breath felt like a small victory. It lent a peculiar urgency and fragility to every human bond, making each shared moment a little more precious, a little more poignant. Emerging from a shadow of pervasive disease and mortality, let's consider how people in the Middle Ages might have signaled attraction, especially when grand romantic gestures were rare and direct expressions of desire were often constrained. We're talking about fashion and allure, subtle signals. Forget overt displays. In a world of strict social hierarchies and moral codes, attraction was often communicated through nuanced cues, hints, and the careful presentation of oneself. You had to read between the lines, or rather, between the layers of wool and linen. For the elite, clothing was a primary visual language, a powerful indicator of wealth, status, and sometimes even marital availability. Rich fabrics like silk, velvet, and brocade, often imported from afar, were clear markers of high standing. Vibrant dyes, particularly reds, blues, and purples, were expensive to produce, so a flash of bright color in your tunic or gown announced your affluence. Imagine seeing someone dressed in deep crimson. It wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a walking billboard of their family's economic power. Jewels, intricate embroidery, and furs also served to highlight status. For a woman, a carefully arranged veil or wimple could signal modesty and piety, while still allowing for a glimpse of attractive hair or features. But it wasn't just about expensive materials. The cut and style of garments, dictated by ever-shifting trends, also played a role. Sometimes tight lacing or fitted bodices might emphasize a slender waist, while a low-cut neckline could hint at décolletage, though often modestly covered by a shift or partlet. For men, broad shoulders and narrow waists were often accentuated by padded doublets or fitted tunics. Long, pointed shoes, palanes, were popular among the wealthy, though incredibly impractical for daily wear, signifying that the wearer didn't have to do much walking. It was a subtle form of peacocking, announcing your desirability through your inability to perform manual labor. Historians still argue whether the extreme fashions, like the impossibly long pelanes, were purely status symbols or also had an underlying, perhaps subconscious, erotic appeal through their impracticality. Beyond clothing, personal grooming, even in its medieval context, played a role. While hygiene was generally basic, attention to clean hands, neatly arranged hair, often braided for women or carefully coiffed for men, and perhaps the use of scented waters or herbal sachets could make a significant difference. Perfumes, often made from musk, ambergris, or floral essences, were used by the wealthy to mask less pleasant odors and to create an aura of sophistication. Imagine catching a faint, exotic scent as someone passed by. It would be a rare and memorable experience in a world primarily dominated by the smells of nature and human activity. A quirky tidbit: while makeup as we know it was not widely used by the general populace, noble women sometimes used white lead powder to lighten their skin, a sign of delicacy and protection from the sun, which indicated they didn't work outdoors. They might also use red ochre or plant dyes to tint their lips and cheeks, creating a subtle blush. These practices, while not as overt as modern cosmetics, were still designed to enhance perceived beauty and attract the eye. You were trying to achieve a certain look, even with limited tools, to signal your health, youth, and fertility. Even gestures and posture played a part. A demure gaze, a modest turn of the head, or a confident, upright stance could communicate volumes without a single word being spoken. In a world where direct flirtation could be risky, these subtle nonverbal cues were essential. So, as you walked through a medieval market or attended a courtly gathering, you'd be constantly evaluating these silent signals, trying to decipher who was available, who was interested, and who simply had too much money and too many pointy shoes. From the subtle signals of fashion, let's transition to the very foundations of medieval society: gender roles. These were strict, deeply ingrained, and largely dictated by a combination of religious doctrine, ancient custom, and the practical necessities of a pre-industrial agrarian society. Yet, despite their rigidity, these roles sometimes bent, blurred, or were challenged in surprising ways. You were born into a world where your gender largely predetermined your life's path, from the clothes you wore to the work you performed, and even the thoughts you were supposed to think. For men, the ideal was often that of the provider and protector. Whether a peasant farmer, a craftsman, or a knight, a man was expected to be strong, capable, and responsible for the welfare of his family. He worked the land, plied his trade, or, if noble, trained for warfare and managed his estates. Masculinity was often tied to physical prowess, courage, and the ability to maintain order and authority within his household and community. You were expected to be decisive, to be the head of your family, and to ensure its survival and prosperity, a heavy burden in a precarious world. Women, on the other hand, were primarily defined by their roles within the domestic sphere and their capacity for reproduction. The ideal woman was chaste, pious, obedient, and fertile. Her main duties revolved around managing the household, raising children, preparing food, and making clothes. Even in peasant families, women worked alongside men in the fields, but their labor was often seen as supplementary to the male head of the household. For noble women, their roles might include overseeing vast households, managing servants, and even running estates in their husband's absence, sometimes with considerable administrative skill. Yet, their legal and social standing remained subordinate to men. Historians still argue whether the practical power wielded by some medieval women, particularly noble women running estates, genuinely undermined the patriarchal societal structure or merely operated within its confines without fundamentally challenging it. However, despite these clear delineations, reality often created exceptions. If a man died, his widow might be forced to take on his trade or manage his lands, demonstrating unexpected competence and resilience. Some women, particularly in urban areas, were able to become successful merchants, innkeepers, or craftswomen, operating with a degree of economic independence. There were even female saints who challenged traditional expectations, becoming revered figures through their piety or intellectual pursuits, providing alternative models for female agency. A quirky tidbit: some medieval guilds, while predominantly male, did allow women to be members, particularly if they were widows continuing their husband's trade, or if their craft, like brewing ale or making certain textiles, was traditionally female. So, while you were expected to fit neatly into a box, sometimes life would demand you step outside of it, and society would grudgingly adapt. This rigid division of roles also influenced perceptions of sexuality. Male desire was often seen as natural, even if it needed to be contained within marriage, while female desire was often viewed with suspicion as something potentially dangerous or sinful if not strictly controlled. This double standard deeply permeated everything from legal codes to medical treatises and popular culture. You were constantly reminded of your place and the expectations that came with it, whether you were a man expected to be stoic and strong, or a woman expected to be demure and fertile. It was a world of boxes, and trying to color outside the lines could be met with disapproval or worse. From the rigid framework of gender roles, let's consider the immense influence of the church's grip, confession, and penance. In the medieval world, the church wasn't just a spiritual guide. It was a pervasive social institution, a moral authority, and a significant political power. Its doctrines reached into every corner of daily life, particularly concerning personal morality and, by extension, sexual behavior. You couldn't escape its watchful eye, or at least the eye of your local priest. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 was a landmark event that mandated annual confession for all adult Christians. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. Imagine having to confess your deepest sins, including any sexual transgressions, to your local priest at least once a year. This act of confession served as a powerful mechanism of social control. You knew that your priest, a figure of spiritual authority in your community, would hear about your illicit desires, your moments of weakness, your acts of fornication or adultery. This constant spiritual surveillance was a significant deterrent for many, fostering a pervasive sense of guilt and the fear of divine punishment. During confession, the priest would listen to your admitted sins and then prescribe a penance. This penance wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was meant to atone for your sins and help you avoid repeating them. Penances could vary widely: reciting specific prayers, fasting for a certain period, making a pilgrimage, giving alms to the poor, or even enduring public humiliation. For sexual sins, the penance often focused on mortification of the flesh or acts of self-denial. Imagine having to stand barefoot outside the church or publicly declare your transgression, all because you succumbed to a moment of passion. It wasn't exactly a private matter. The confessional also gave the church an extraordinary window into the private lives of its parishioners. Priests, though bound by the seal of confession, gained an intimate understanding of the moral landscape of their communities. This knowledge, while not to be revealed, undoubtedly informed their sermons, their pastoral advice, and the moral climate they sought to enforce. It created a constant dialogue between the individual's conscience and the church's doctrine, reinforcing the idea that every thought and action was subject to divine judgment. Historians still argue whether the widespread practice of confession genuinely fostered moral behavior or primarily served to instill fear and obedience to church authority. Was it a tool for spiritual growth or social control? A quirky tidbit: confessors often used detailed penitential handbooks, or some may confessorum, which listed various sins and their corresponding penances. Some of these handbooks contained surprisingly specific and sometimes graphically detailed descriptions of sexual sins, showing just how thoroughly the church attempted to categorize and control every aspect of human desire. It's almost like a medieval how-to guide for sinning, inadvertently providing a comprehensive list of transgressions you didn't even know existed. You might hear the priest reference a particular species of sin, making you wonder just how many ways one could, apparently, displease the Almighty. So, while desires might have been universal, The church's omnipresent authority meant that acting on them outside of approved channels came with significant spiritual and social risks. You lived in a world where your soul's eternal fate was intimately linked to your sexual conduct, and the confessional was the ultimate accountability mechanism, a direct line to divine judgment, ensuring that even your most private acts were, in a sense, never truly private. Stepping away from the direct gaze of the church, let's peer into the shadowy corners where reason often yielded to the unseen forces of magic and superstition. In the medieval mind, the world was alive with unseen powers, spirits, and hidden influences, and when confronted with illness, misfortune, or the unpredictable nature of love and fertility, people often resorted to practices that blended folk wisdom with outright magical thinking. You were surrounded by beliefs that seem utterly bizarre today, but which offered a desperate sense of control in a chaotic world. Imagine being ill, or wanting to conceive, or even trying to attract a lover, and having no scientific understanding of biology or psychology. What do you turn? Often to the local wise woman, the cunning man, or the village elder who possessed knowledge of charms, amulets, and potions. These weren't necessarily seen as evil magic by the common folk, but rather as practical tools to influence a world that felt largely beyond their control. For instance, to ensure fertility or successful pregnancy, a woman might wear a specific stone, carry a dried plant, or perform a ritual at a sacred well. These practices existed alongside, and sometimes even intertwined with, Christian devotion. You might pray to a saint for a child, but also wear a rabbit's foot for good measure. When it came to matters of the heart and body, the line between medicine and magic was particularly blurry. Love charms were common, often involving bizarre ingredients or rituals designed to ignite passion or ensure fidelity. A quirky tidbit: some folk remedies for impotence or to increase male virility included consuming the ground-up brains of sparrows or eating specific parts of a wolf. Imagine trying to explain that recipe to your local butcher. These were not considered medical treatments in the modern sense, but rather ways to manipulate the invisible energies believed to govern attraction and physical function. You'd probably try it, wouldn't you, if it promised results and all other avenues had failed? Desperation makes you surprisingly open-minded. Similarly, to ward off unwanted advances or to break a spell of bad luck, people might employ countercharms. If a cow stopped giving milk or a child fell ill, it might be attributed to an evil eye or a malevolent spirit, requiring specific rituals or protective amulets to undo the damage. The fear of witchcraft, though it escalated dramatically in later centuries, was already present, leading to suspicion and even persecution for those suspected of harnessing darker powers. Historians still argue whether these widespread magical beliefs were a testament to a fundamental lack of scientific understanding, or if they represented a resilient, pre-Christian spiritual worldview that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with official church doctrine. So, while the church provided a framework for moral and spiritual life, people often turned to folk magic for practical solutions to earthly problems, especially those related to love, health, and fertility. You lived in a world where a sudden illness could be cured by a strange incantation, where an unrequited love could be sparked by a carefully brewed potion, and where the forces of the unseen were just as real and often more immediately influential than the pronouncements of any distant bishop. It was a world brimming with secrets, whispered remedies, and a constant, hopeful reach towards the mystical. Having explored the realm of magical beliefs, let's turn to a part of medieval history that has often been deliberately obscured or simply ignored: queer lives, hidden histories. In a society overwhelmingly shaped by Christian doctrine, which condemned non-procreative sexual acts, same-sex relationships, and gender nonconformity faced severe societal and legal prohibitions. Yet, despite the pervasive hostility, individuals existed who loved, desired, and expressed themselves in ways that defied the dominant norms, carving out precarious spaces within a largely unforgiving world. You were forced into the shadows, your true self a dangerous secret. The church's stance was unequivocally condemnatory. Scriptural interpretations and theological writings denounced sodomy as a grave sin, often linking it to other perceived moral failings and even natural disasters. This condemnation applied not only to male same-sex acts, but, by extension, to any sexual activity considered unnatural or non-procreative, which implicitly included female same-sex relations, though these were less frequently discussed or prosecuted. The penalties for such acts, if discovered, could be severe, ranging from public shaming and imprisonment to, in extreme cases, burning at the stake, particularly in later periods of intensified moral panic. Imagine living with that level of fear, knowing that merely existing as yourself could lead to such a brutal end. Despite this oppression, evidence of same-sex relationships surfaces in various forms. In some monastic communities, particularly among women, intensely emotional and sometimes physically intimate bonds formed, often cloaked in the language of spiritual sisterhood or devotion. While the church aimed for celibacy, human affection found ways to express itself, sometimes blurring the lines between platonic and romantic love. For men, records from legal proceedings, while obviously biased and punitive, nonetheless reveal instances of same-sex sexual activity occurring across different social strata. These were not open declarations of identity, but rather glimpses into clandestine encounters. Historians still argue whether the apparent scarcity of direct evidence for same-sex relationships reflects their actual rarity or simply the effectiveness of societal repression in erasing or disguising such narratives. Was it truly uncommon or just extremely well hidden? A quirky tidbit: some medieval literature, particularly certain poetic traditions, contains ambiguous language that modern scholars interpret as hinting at same-sex desire, or at least a playful blurring of gender roles and affections. These might not be explicit, but the subtext can be read as challenging conventional norms, offering a tantalizing glimpse into a more nuanced emotional landscape than official records suggest. You might find a knight professing intense devotion to another knight, couched in terms that feel almost romantic, leaving you to wonder about the true nature of their bond. Beyond sexual relationships, there's also limited but fascinating evidence of gender nonconformity. Individuals who might today identify as transgender or gender nonconforming would have faced even greater challenges. Records sometimes speak of women who lived as men, or men who adopted female roles, often for practical reasons like safety or economic opportunity, but sometimes hinting at a deeper sense of identity. These were often cases of survival, but they also highlight the rigid boxes people were forced into and the ingenious ways some managed to navigate or escape them, however temporarily. So, while queer lives in the Middle Ages were largely hidden, lived in secrecy and under immense threat, their whispers can still be heard if you listen closely enough, reminding us that diversity of desire and identity is not a modern invention, but a persistent thread throughout human history. Having explored the often hidden world of queer lives, let's now turn to a far more visible, though still complex, aspect of medieval society: prostitution, a regulated necessity. While the church condemned all non-marital sexual activity, prostitution, paradoxically, was often tolerated, regulated, and even taxed by urban authorities across medieval Europe. It was seen by many, especially city officials, as a necessary evil, a way to contain and control illicit sexual urges and protect the honor of respectable women. You were in a world where moral principles and pragmatic realities often clashed, and practicality usually won. In many medieval towns and cities, prostitution was not pushed entirely underground, but existed in designated areas, often on the outskirts of town or in specific alleys. These areas might be known as stews, brothels, or public houses, and they were sometimes even owned or licensed by the municipal government or local lords. This regulation was a significant mainstream historical fact. It wasn't a free-for-all. Licensing prostitutes and brothels allowed authorities to collect taxes, maintain a degree of public order, and, theoretically, prevent the spread of venereal diseases, though their understanding of contagion was, of course, rudimentary. Imagine a medieval city council meeting debating the price of a license for the local stew, a bizarre blend of moral rectitude and financial opportunism. The women who worked as prostitutes often came from the lowest strata of society, driven by poverty, abandonment, or lack of other opportunities. Their lives were undoubtedly harsh, precarious, and often short, marked by stigma, exploitation, and vulnerability to disease. While they might earn more than a domestic servant, their social standing was at rock bottom, and they were often denied the sacraments by the church unless they repented. Yet, for some, it offered a path to survival, however desperate. Historians still argue whether the municipal regulation of prostitution genuinely protected these women by offering a semblance of legality and order, or if it merely formalized their exploitation and reinforced their marginalized status. A quirky tidbit: in some medieval cities, specific days or times might be set aside when prostitutes were allowed to walk freely in public, or were certain identifying garments, like a striped hood or a yellow cloak, to distinguish them from respectable women. This was ostensibly to prevent confusion and protect the reputations of others, but it also served to publicly mark and ostracize them. Imagine being forced to wear a sign of your profession, openly advertising your marginalization, every time you stepped outside your door. It was a visible reminder of your place in society. Some wealthy patrons and even high-ranking clergy were known to frequent brothels, despite the church's official condemnation. This created a peculiar hypocrisy, where the sin was publicly denounced but privately indulged, highlighting the persistent gap between doctrine and practice. So, while the church thundered against fornication and lust, the municipal authorities often took a more pragmatic view, seeing prostitution as a necessary outlet for male sexual urges that, if left unchecked, might lead to more disruptive behaviors like rape or seduction of virtuous women. It was a safety valve, albeit one built on the backs of marginalized women. You were living in a society that simultaneously condemned and condoned, all in the name of maintaining a fragile social order. From the regulated spaces of medieval brothels, let's transition to another fundamental aspect of life that directly intersected with sexuality and human bodies: medical practices. If you needed anything beyond a rudimentary herbal poultice for a cut, you were entering a world of primitive, often perilous, and frankly alarming healthcare. Forget sterile environments, anesthetics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory. Medieval medicine was a fascinating, often brutal, blend of ancient Greek and Roman theories, folk remedies, astrology, and a heavy dose of prayer. You were essentially trusting your life to guesswork and tradition, hoping for the best. The dominant medical theory was humorism, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen. This held that the human body was composed of 4 basic humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was believed to result from an imbalance of these humors. The primary goal of a medieval physician, therefore, was to restore balance. This led to practices that seem horrifyingly counterintuitive today. For instance, if you had a fever which was believed to be an excess of blood, the solution was often bloodletting. Imagine being deliberately cut with a lancet or having leeches applied to your skin, slowly draining your blood, all in an attempt to make you better. It was a mainstream historical fact, performed by barbers, surgeons, and physicians alike, and you would have accepted it as standard procedure, even as you felt yourself weakening. Diagnosis often involved examining urine, tasting it, or scrutinizing its color and consistency, along with feeling your pulse and observing your complexion. Astrology also played a significant role. A physician might consult a star chart to determine the best time for a treatment or surgery, believing that celestial bodies influenced bodily functions. A quirky tidbit: some physicians even consulted dream interpreters for clues about a patient's illness, blurring the lines between physical symptoms and spiritual or psychological states. You might find yourself describing a vivid nightmare to your doctor, who would nod sagely, believing it held the key to your ailment. Childbirth, a profoundly intimate and often dangerous experience, highlights the perils of medieval medicine. Midwives, usually women, attended births, relying on experience and traditional knowledge. Without sterile instruments or pain relief beyond perhaps some herbal concoctions, both mother and child faced immense risks of infection, hemorrhage, and fatal complications. Puerperal fever, an infection contracted during childbirth, was a rampant killer of new mothers. Infant mortality, as we've noted, was heartbreakingly high. You were taking a terrifying gamble with your life and the life of your child every time a new baby was due. Surgical procedures were rare and excruciating. Amputations were performed, often without effective anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong drink. An infection was almost inevitable. Bone setting was attempted, and sometimes successful, but largely through trial and error. Pain was a constant, expected part of any significant medical intervention. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of herbal remedies, which sometimes had genuine medicinal properties, provided more actual relief than the more invasive and theoretical humor-based treatments. Was a local wise woman's brew more effective than the university-trained doctor's bleeding? So, when thinking about medieval bodies and intimacy, remember they were bodies constantly susceptible to illness, subject to painful, often ineffective treatments, and reliant on a blend of ancient theory and desperate folk wisdom. Your health, and by extension your ability to participate in the physical aspects of life, was a fragile thing, constantly at the mercy of forces largely beyond human understanding or control. It was a time when just surviving was a testament to sheer resilience. Having navigated the perilous landscape of medieval medical practices, let's bring our journey to a close by contemplating childhood and legacy, the future's hope. In a world defined by high mortality rates, harsh realities, and rudimentary medicine, the birth and survival of children were not just personal joys, but acts of profound optimism, a desperate gamble for the continuation of the family, the community, and indeed, civilization itself. You were living in a time when every child represented a fragile, yet potent, spark of hope against the overwhelming odds of the age. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a profoundly different experience than it is today. It was often short, marked by early exposure to adult responsibilities, and, as we've touched upon, fraught with peril. Infancy was a period of extreme vulnerability, with a significant percentage of children not surviving their first year. Those who did survive would quickly transition from play to labor, often by the age of 7 or 8, learning the skills necessary to contribute to the household or the family trade. A peasant child would be helping in the fields, a craftsman's child learning an apprenticeship, a noble child beginning their education in courtly manners or warfare. There was no extended adolescence as we know it. Adulthood arrived swiftly and demandingly. Imagine being expected to pull your weight, physically and mentally, before you even hit your teens. Despite the harshness, parents certainly loved their children. Accounts of grief over lost infants and deep affection for surviving offspring abound in personal letters and chronicles. However, the omnipresent threat of death often led to a more pragmatic approach to attachment, a necessary emotional resilience. You couldn't afford to be completely consumed by every loss, or you would simply cease to function. The sheer number of children often born to a single couple also meant that parental attention, while present, was necessarily diffused. Historians still argue whether medieval parents deliberately practiced emotional detachment due to high mortality, or if their expressions of love simply differed from modern sensibilities. Was it a coping mechanism, or a different cultural understanding of family bonds? The drive for legacy, however, was paramount. For medieval individuals, particularly men, the continuation of their lineage was a deeply ingrained social and personal imperative. Children, especially sons, ensured that the family name, property, and traditions would endure beyond one's own lifespan. In a society without formal social security or retirement plans, Adult children were also your primary form of support in old age. A family without heirs faced the very real threat of dissolution. Its accumulated wealth and status perhaps passing to distant relatives or the church. You were not just raising children. You were investing in your future and the future of your entire ancestral line. This deep-seated need for progeny undoubtedly influenced every aspect of medieval sexual and marital life, from the pragmatic considerations of arranged marriages to the desperate search for fertility remedies. Every act of intimacy, whether within or outside the bounds of sanctioned marriage, carried the implicit and often explicit hope or fear of new life. A quirky tidbit, baptism, often performed within days of birth, was incredibly important not just for spiritual salvation, but also as a way to formally acknowledge the child's existence and integrate them into the community, especially given the high risk of infant death. It was a race against time, ensuring the soul's salvation and the child's formal entry into the world. So, as we conclude our journey through the grimy, often perilous, and surprisingly complex realities of medieval intimacy, remember that beneath the strict doctrines and crude conditions, human life persisted, driven by the same fundamental desires and hopes that animate us today. The struggle for connection, the drive for procreation, and the enduring hope for a legacy, all played out against a backdrop vastly different from our own, yet deeply relatable. You've seen how they managed desire, dealt with disease, and brought forth new life in a world that demanded resilience at every turn. And now, it's time for you to finally rest. All right, that's it for our deep dive into the sometimes uncomfortable truths of medieval life. As the final echoes of those distant bells fade and the flickering torchlight of history dims, feel yourself easing back into the quiet comfort of your own bed. Let the sounds of that ancient world, the rustic smells, the whispers of hidden desires, all soften and blend into the peaceful hum of your modern surroundings. There's no need to cling to the grit and struggle of centuries past. That's their story, not yours. Just let your thoughts drift, light as dust motes in a forgotten sunbeam. The pressures of medieval living, the harsh hygiene, the strict social ruleless theory all dissolving, becoming as faint as a distant dream. Feel the warmth of your covers, the gentle rhythm of your breathing, and simply allow yourself to sink deeper, deeper into comfort. Tomorrow is a new day, but tonight is for quiet, for stillness, for complete and utter rest.